So, Andrew Cohen, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this interview, Interviews with the Leading Edge. You're a well-known teacher of evolutionary enlightenment. You've written numerous books. You used to be the publisher of Enlightened Next magazine and the former spiritual leader guru for a community known as Enlightened Next, Fox Hollow. So before we go into that and your 4-year sabbatical too, I'm just interested, curious about your own backstory, your path to becoming a teacher of evolutionary enlightenment, how that came to be.
Well, I was brought up as a secular Jew, so the word God never meant anything to me. And one night when I was living in Rome with my mother when I was 16 years old, we stayed up late and we were having a conversation about something. I don't remember what we were talking about, but suddenly there was a very powerful opening in my consciousness, and the doors of perception. The doors of perception opened very wide, and it seemed that the walls of the apartment seemed to disappear, and I had an experience of what's called cosmic consciousness. And in that moment, it became apparent to me that everything that exists and everything that doesn't exist is all one conscious being without beginning or end. The nature of this being was a kind of impersonal absolute love that in that moment I was experiencing it. It was physically crushing, it was overwhelming. And I experienced a kind of awe that I'd never known before. And I was in a state of awe and wonder at the miraculous nature of what was revealing itself to me. And I'd never been so touched by anything in my life.
Oh, and this is at the age of 16.
Yeah. And I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that what was happening and what I was experiencing was more real than anything else I'd ever known. So that was my first spiritual initiation. And I wanted to become a jazz drummer, so I pursued my interests, but I had doubts about whether I had enough talent, whether I was really good enough to succeed. And simultaneously, this experience was haunting me quite a bit, because when I had this experience, at the end of this experience, it sounds a little strange, but there was a message, which if you surrender your life to me and me alone, you have nothing to fear. So there was a sense of being called. And so when I was 22, I decided to give up my dreams of becoming a musician and became a full-time seeker. And I started reading spiritual books about Buddhism and yoga and things, and took initiation from an Indian teacher, and I learned how to meditate. I was studying martial arts. And I made up my mind that I was going to become an enlightened person. And it was the only thing in my life that I'd ever have confidence that I could actually do. And the reason for that was because the experience I had when I was a young man was so powerful that when I was reading about the experiences that these spiritual masters were describing in the books I was reading, I knew what they were talking about. I knew that it was real because I had experienced it myself. And I knew somehow I was going to find my way. I was going to succeed. And so I eventually went to India when I was 27. And 4 years later, I met my guru. And I spent 3 weeks in his company. And I asked him the most important questions that I had about the nature of existence and the ultimate nature of reality. He answered all my questions. He told me when I left his company, I spent 3 weeks with him, that something very big was going to happen. And when I left him, I underwent a kind of a metaphysical process, a powerful kind of an explosive metaphysical ordeal, where I felt like I was being consumed by a presence that felt like love, but it was a kind of love that was so intense that it was, the intensity of the feeling experience was challenging to endure, but the nature and the quality of this thing that was happening to me was, I knew that the nature, I was being pulled into, it seemed like a vortex that was infinite. And my ordinary sense of myself as being a limited individual who exists in a particular body, in a particular mind, in a particular place, was suddenly being consumed by a presence and a consciousness that seemed infinite. And it was literally like I could literally feel myself being consumed. And I knew in that moment that everything that I'd ever wanted, since I made up my mind that I wanted to be free, was actually happening to me. And I was both ecstatic and actually quite terrified because it was so overwhelming and so completely terrifying. And in the midst of this experience, I suddenly had access to a kind of wisdom and a kind of knowledge that I hadn't known before and that I hadn't even earned. It was suddenly mine. It seemed it was the gift of the grace of my own teacher that gave me access to this wisdom. And so I would just start speaking to people about what had happened to me and what was happening to me in the process I was going through. And as I was doing this, people seemed to be consumed or drawn into the very state of consciousness I was in. That was really the beginning. And then I just started, the teaching just started happening. I didn't really decide to do it. It just started happening through me. And people started responding with great
Great interest. Yeah.
with great interest, with great awe, with great
Yeah.
gratitude. And that was the beginning, and that was in 1986.
Yeah. And the concept of evolutionary enlightenment, was that something you were teaching right from the beginning?
No. That I've always been very philosophically oriented in my thinking. I always want to know why. And I tended not to take things at face value. I'd always question and think about what I was hearing. So the issue of the whole point of the evolutionary enlightenment really came into that. I've been teaching for 30 years. So there was a slow developmental process in my thinking that took at least 15 years to get to the point where I put enlightenment in the context of evolution. That took a long time.
Yeah. So since we're talking about this phrase, how do you define evolutionary enlightenment?
Well, evolutionary enlightenment takes the traditional Eastern notion of metaphysical enlightenment, the enlightenment of the Buddha, into the context of the Western science's discovery of evolution. So the evolutionary process started when the universe was created 14 billion years ago. As far as we know, before the creative process was initiated, there was no thing whatsoever. There was no time, and there was no space, and there was no form. Nothing existed. And then this creative process was catalyzed, and from out of nothing came energy and matter, which after about 10 billion years gave rise to life, which eventually gave rise to the emergence of mind. And so when we from the vantage point of where we are now, we look back to the beginning of time, the beginning of the creative process, we see there's something happening here. Energy and matter gave rise to life, which gave rise to mind. We realize there's a developmental progression of emergent becoming. The universe is giving rise to greater complexity. And what's very important for us, and what's most interesting, is that this creative process has given rise to consciousness or interiority or knowing. So this capacity for consciousness and this capacity for knowing that the creative process gave rise to and is giving rise to, as far as we know, has reached its apex in human beings. And it's only in conscious human beings that this creative process gains the capacity to bear witness to itself, or to awaken to itself, or to know itself, or to see itself. And that's because human beings have complex cognition and complex consciousness, and specifically we have the capacity to know that we know, or to be aware of awareness. For a highly evolved sentient being that has the capacity to bear witness to consciousness, or to know that you know, that capacity makes it possible for us to bear witness to the creative process as a whole, to be conscious of it. So when we realize that the energy intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe gains the capacity to bear witness to itself and cognize itself in and through us as human beings, we in that recognition we gain a cosmocentric appreciation for the meaning and its significance of our own existence here in this world.
Mm-hmm.
And so because when we realize that the magnitude of the implications of that are enormous. So to put it in theological terms, if we'd say that God is the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, we could also say that it is only through this highly evolved human capacity for consciousness and cognition that God, or the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, is able to bear witness to himself or herself.
Mm-hmm.
This gives enormous significance then to my life and to your life and to our lives. And it's a different kind of significance than we've ever known before. So evolutionary enlightenment as a teaching is based upon this the discovery of this new cosmocentric identity or self-sense.
Mm-hmm.
And the degree to which we awaken to this and really appreciate its significance, we begin then to reorient our relationship to life based upon the significance of that realization. It's deeply transformative.
Yeah, and from just the ideas floating around my head, there's an integration of science and philosophy and spirituality, and just understanding the evolutionary process, both scientifically, spiritually. Would you say that also?
Well, in terms of the metaphysical philosophy of enlightenment, putting enlightenment in an evolutionary context changes the meaning of enlightenment, because because when I speak about enlightenment, I'm not talking about the Western enlightenment. I'm talking about the Eastern enlightenment, the enlightenment of the Buddha. So, uh, so, so his awakening took place at a time when there was no understanding of linear time. Time was understood to be cyclical or circular or cyclical, which meant that the time where these kalpas, or these long periods where there was always a predictable outcome. So going around in a merry-go-round, you go through a certain process and come back to the beginning, and you start again, and go around through the same process and come back to the beginning and start again. It's called the wheel of becoming in Buddhism. They call it the wheel of becoming. So at that time, if you realize, man, I've been through this so many times, it's the same old thing, birth and death and birth and death in the same cycle, and I've been captured by the illusion of wanting to be part of this same repetitive process that just is going to lead to pain, disappointment, suffering, and death. I want to get out of here. And so then the liberation from being trapped on this merry-go-round that goes around and around forever, comes back to the beginning and starts again, was the awakening to what the Buddha called the deathless, or this. It's awakening to that mysterious no place or domain from which the entire universe emerged, where there's no time and there's no space and there's no form and nothing ever happened, and where there's no beginning and there's no end. There's only emptiness. And we can find access to this depth dimension if we enter into very deep and profound states of meditation, when we really are able to transcend, let go of the mind. We can seek deeper and deeper and deeper into this mysterious no place. And this deeper we sink into this mysterious no place, we experience a kind of ineffable bliss and freedom that is so extraordinary. It's such a state of rapture. It's the ultimate relief and release from being trapped in a mind and a body and a personality. So in the way I think about it, this traditional notion of Eastern enlightenment or Eastern liberation is about getting out of here. It's what the English biologist Rupert Sheldrake referred to as vertical liftoff. It's what releases you. You get out of here, and the ultimate idea is you want to get free from the prison of time and space and body and mind and form. That's the promise. If you become fully enlightened, you'll never have to return back to Earth. You'll never have to return back to having a body. You'll be free from all of this. But in evolutionary enlightenment, we come to a very different conclusion, because we say, well, the energy and intelligence that created the universe took about 14 billion years to create a conscious, sentient life form with enough complex consciousness where he or she could begin to cognize the entire creative process. As we cognize the entire creative process, we realize that that God, or the energy and intelligence that created the universe, can only take the next step through us, as us. These hands, this body, this mind, these hands are not Andrew Cohen's body, mind, and hand, but they are the energy and intelligences, and the energy and intelligence that created the universe's hands, awakening to itself through the body, mind, personality of Andrew Cohen. But Andrew Cohen is just a vehicle. He's really just a partial, temporary appearance here.
Mm-hmm.
And who's really pulling the levers is this great cosmic, you could call it this great cosmic ambition, this desire to exist, because the energy, the experience of the energy and intelligence that created the universe is a drive to exist. It's an impulse towards existence. It's a wanting to exist. I want to be here, and I want to create the future.
Mm-hmm.
And human beings can actually tangibly experience that as the creative drive,
Mm-hmm.
the creative drive to give rise to greater complexity in whatever we happen to do. If we're in science, in art, in music, or in spirituality, there's a drive, there's a creative drive that's driving the human race. And when you really see, oh, that's what this is all about, is awakening to and giving rise to the liberating my own creative capacities, the highest form of happiness that we can experience as an embodied human being is through doing that. Because people who get very good at what they do, whether it's in science or music or spirituality, whatever it is, they lose themselves in the creative process.
Mm-hmm.
And in that there's a liberation from the endless torments of the separate personality and ego, because then you really feel you're at one with the creative process, and the creative process is expressing itself dramatically through you, and you are contributing. You're making a difference. You're making the world that the energy and intelligence that gave rise to all of this gave rise to. You're making it just that much better, a little better, because of your presence here. So in evolutionary enlightenment, we discover an absolute sense of purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And then it means something to exist, and we have a reason to be here. We have an absolute reason to be here that makes complete and perfect sense out of why am I here.
Uh-huh.
And so the big problem is people don't know why they exist, and especially for us, for those of us who are postmodern, and we're very privileged and we're very educated, we're very fortunate, but most of us suffer from a deep existential lack of knowing, well, why am I really here and why is this happening? Because we know so many people who have everything are not happy.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can have everything and know everything and still be lost. But when we discover this non-relative or absolute sense of purpose and purposefulness, then life becomes a sacred obligation. So then if we find ourselves here, we realize, oh, I can't mess this up, and I've got to do a very good job, and I have to really make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
It's my, as the energy and intelligence that created the universe, who's waking up to him or herself through the body, mind form of myself or yourself, there's a sense of an obligation to do God's work.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the point is really all about liberating ourselves from an unenlightened sense of identity to an enlightened sense of identity, so we can be full-heartedly and wholeheartedly participate here. And so it's like being liberated into life.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, what I call the old definition of enlightenment, which is about being liberated from life, no longer makes any sense. At least to me, it doesn't.
Yeah, and it sounds like too, like personal enlightenment is more about myself, my individual, and
Sure,
feeling
absolutely.
good, and that not I don't want to say that in negative terms, but
Sure.
evolutionary enlightenment is more about resonating with the universal, the creative impulse of the universe, or the evolutionary impulse.
It's focused very much on that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole point. And so then, of course, the position of the traditional enlightenment, which is really based on being free from the mind,
Mm-hmm.
free from conditioning. This is at least the aspiration, the idea, is we want to learn how to do that. We want to learn how to develop those capacities, but not merely for our own metaphysical and emotional and psychological relief, but so we can be better actors here in the world.
Mm-hmm. So so as you say, this where I was saying too, the evolutionary impulse is a creative impulse, and that we're saying the universe itself is a creative universe, and
It's one process. It's all one
Yeah.
creative process.
yeah,
And if you realize it's basically the awakening to evolution is realizing that you're part of a process that's going somewhere.
mm-hmm.
And so then the next step is I'm part of a process that's going somewhere, and I can either be dragged along in the wake of this and just struggle and survive the best I can,
Mm-hmm.
or I can actually I can actually want to be very much part of the very leading edge of this thing. So
Mm-hmm.
I can in our own small but hopefully not completely insignificant way, we can help to co-author the universe project.
Mm-hmm.
We can help to be co-authors with God, with the energy and intelligence that created the universe, of where all this is going.
Yeah, and that reminds me of two quotes. One from Ken Wilber, who said that evolution is spirit in action,
Right.
and the other from the former Catholic priest Matthew Fox, who said that the first sign of spirit is courage. So, in a way, awakening to the evolutionary impulse is a courageous act.
Well, I wouldn't say that awakening to it takes courage, but I think surrendering to it takes courage.
Well, that's
Surrendering to
good.
it, allowing yourself to be taken by it, and committing yourself to the implications, which are demanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because when you awaken to this current or this motion, it challenges one. It challenges one's. It challenges our previously held conscious and unconscious convictions about who we are, why we're here, and how life is supposed to be lived.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what can be very frightening is when we're being spiritually compelled in one direction, but our habit is going into another. It creates quite an existential challenge.
Yeah. And so you, over the years of teaching evolutionary enlightenment, you created a community and also the magazine, Enlighten Next. And I'm just, it was a great magazine. I love the magazine. But originally it was called What is Enlightenment? I'm wondering, was that part of also your own evolution in teaching?
It was completely about my own evolution, because because I was always a questioner and an inquirer. I wanted to know why. So I'd picked up a lot of very traditional ideas, and then when I became a teacher overnight, and then I started teaching, and I came to the West, I just was feeling something. Some of this stuff just doesn't make sense. What does that enlightenment even mean when you come to go out of a traditional context and go into a postmodern context? And so I had so many questions, and so what I did is I made these questions into a the energy behind asking the questions became the magazine, and then with a small group of my students, we would sit around together and inquire and come up with questions and work on them, and then start doing interviews. But the questions led to intriguing answers, which also, as a teacher, I was developing this whole idea of enlightenment not only being a subjective interior experience of a unique individual, as what I'd always thought it was. It was an inner experience of one unique individual. I thought, well, if this state of consciousness, this state of unity consciousness, could become the foundation, the shared foundation between two individuals or more, then the context of relationship or relatedness could be infinity.
Mm-hmm.
And so that became the next phase of the teaching, was about what was this was looking at what could happen, and how our shared culture, the experience of our shared cultural experience of relatedness, could change if we could bring this interior experience and make it, instead of being subjective, make it intersubjective. And then the next step is when we realize that this intersubjective infinite ground, which is enlightened awareness, was actually part of this process, is actually going somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
That was the third unfolding of all that. And so when that becomes the ground, the intersubjective ground that you're actually sharing with another human being, it changes the context of relationship entirely, and in the most extraordinary ways.
Yeah. And so there's a term, evolutionary. One of your former students, Carter Phipps, wrote a book, Evolutionaries. And would you define evolutionary as someone who awakens to the evolutionary impulse?
Yes, to some degree, an evolutionary is someone who really gets evolution, who's had an awakening. It's not just an intellectual understanding, but an awakening to the fact that we are all part and parcel of a process that had a beginning in time, or began with the emergence of time, that's going somewhere and is becoming more and more of itself. That is it's becoming more complex. It's complexifying. That the process is going somewhere, and going somewhere means it's complexifying. So it's giving rise to greater and greater potentials that didn't exist before, which makes it so thrilling and miraculous and so unbelievably exciting, because then you realize you're part of the ultimate adventure. And so an evolutionary, at least in the way I would define it, is someone who knows that at the deepest level of their being. It's a kind of awakening.
Yeah.
Because when you wake up to that, it changes the way you see everything.
And I know that and in the book, The Evolutionaries, he profiled a lot of different people who were in all different facets of life, and it reminded me of the term that Barbara Marx Hubbard would use of vocational arousal. So in a way, that's
Barbara has had this awakening long before any of us did.
So it's something where you just feel that impulse, and where you are in the world is just vocational arousal, or you just.
Well, it's literally like a religious calling.
Yeah, yeah. So you had the community in Lenox, Enlighten Next at Fox Hollow.
Yeah.
And I saw that you've described that as it was a creative utopian experiment of commitment and shared aspiration, and that you succeeded in profound and important ways. And for a period of time, we were at the very leading edge of spiritual endeavor in the world. And then, but it's not there anymore. Well, first I want to ask, what made it a utopian experiment?
Well, because the creative impulse, the evolutionary impulse, is the experience of the promise of utopia. So I have to explain this. The human being can experience the evolutionary impulse at three different levels of their being. So the first level is the easiest one, which is the biological level. So we can experience the evolutionary impulse as the sexual impulse, the procreative impulse. So what is because then that's the energy. We can experience the vibration and the pulsation of the energy and intelligence that created the universe. When we experience the sexual impulse, what does the sexual impulse feel like? It feels like ecstasy and urgency, ecstatic urgency. And it's ecstatic urgency which says, if you follow this ecstatically urgent impulse, you will experience utopia. So the promise of utopia, we know what the meaning of the promise of utopia in the sexual engagement is, but it's the promise of a complete fulfillment. But so that's at the biological level. Then at much higher creative levels for human beings, there's in all fields of human endeavor. If you get like a very gifted composer, someone like a Mozart, is overcome with this need to create music, and it's the same kind of utopian drive. Whereas if I do everything I can to give rise to this impulse that's coming through me, I will give rise. It's the promise of utopia. It's the same with science, and with the birth of democracy, with all creative emergence, is the promise of utopia. The promise of perfection is what it really is. It's the promise of perfection, and when you realize that's what the whole creative drive, that's what's driving us, is the promise of perfection, of perfect and total.
Yeah.
So at the spiritual level, it's just at the highest level is what's compelling us, is the promise of perfection. Is that the promise of perfection is a utopian impulse. So the evolutionary impulse, the nature of the evolutionary impulse is a utopian impulse by its nature in and of itself. So throughout history, prophets and spiritual leaders who have gathered communities around them, these communities would, especially if they were radical experiments, people usually give up the lives they were leading in order to follow the realizer who was promising a higher calling. Like the followers of Jesus, walked out on their families to be with him because of what he was calling them to. Followers of the Buddha left their families because of the calling was the promise of utopia. So in most of these experiments are utopian experiments.
Yeah. And actually, after I saw that quote, I thought about the magazine Enlighten Next saying, it really was, every issue was like a transmission. even with, I mean, reading the articles made it even more of a transmission.
That's what we were aiming for.
Yeah, yeah. I never really thought of it like
and
that.
we were literally lit up
Mm-hmm.
to what it is we were speaking about, and we were very much consciously trying to convey a perspective, and the perspective was driven by this consciousness that we're discussing together.
Yeah.
So, and it did get transmitted through the pages of the magazine.
But as of now, Fox Hollow and Light Next is not in existence, or the organization is
No, we went
changed.
through a very big crisis that was primarily catalyzed by me actually contradicting some of the very things I've been speaking to you about, because fundamentally what happened was that I, as a spiritual teacher, I was upholding a mythic teaching structure, a mythic hierarchy, and part of this mythic hierarchy was based upon my own traditionally held belief in my own. I thought that my awakening was perfect or flawless, and they have, in Buddhism, they call the word for this is like you're called you're an arhat, someone who's fully realized, or in Vedanta they call it Jivan Mukta. So I believed these things about myself, and I also in my community I had absolute power and absolute authority. So at a certain point, after like 20 years, 25 years, some of my students who'd grown up with me were adults who needed to be liberated from the obligations in the traditional guru model. And for many of them, they needed to individuate. It's like when you have to individuate from your parent. In many ways, some elder students needed to fully self-actualize. In order to do that, they needed to be liberated from the very structure that had created all this. And at the time, I didn't have the eyes to see this, that there were very logical developmental needs they had, and I perceived their need for growth as a threat to the structure that we all created together. So instead, and they wanted to address some of these things with me, but instead of me responding with curiosity and humility, I responded with anger and pride, and I felt that they were threatening my position, which no one had ever done before, and I didn't react very well. It's a very complex story. There's a lot of parts to it, but fundamentally, this was the reason which led to me agreeing to take some time off so I could do some period of introspection and spiritual practice to understand what happened. And it really took me about 3 or 4 years. It's taken me a long time to actually come to terms with it and understand what was going on. But to everyone's surprise, very shortly after I said that I was going to take a sabbatical, the community started to fall apart all over the world. And many people were surprised how quickly it happened. And I think still are.
Yeah. So would you say the model of personal enlightenment, the model of evolutionary enlightenment bumped up against each other?
Well, it wasn't the model of personal enlightenment. It has to do because it has to do with the traditional guru model. Because in the traditional guru model, the guru is seen as being perfect and all-knowing, and not really, and not really possible that someone like that could have egoic motives, shadow, or make important mistakes. But postmodernity and integral psychology has taught us everybody has a shadow, nobody's perfect. And that even the great gift of enlightenment and enlightened awareness doesn't protect us from these things. So going through this great ordeal has helped me to face into a lot of this, and I'm still in the process of coming to terms with a lot of it. But it's also taking this experience that was a gift from my guru to me, and taking it out of a mythological context and bring it more into a postmodern one, and hopefully bring it into a postmodern one.
And so I'm curious to follow up that question, but before that, I'm also curious, it was almost like 4 years of sabbatical journey.
It's been
What's that been like?
It's been the hardest thing I've ever experienced. I was in India. I mean, more than anything else, it was the experience of suffering, of great ordeal of suffering, and of realizing I wasn't the person that I thought I was. I wasn't the perfect hero that I thought I was,
Mhm.
and facing into issues around pride
Uh-huh.
and also treating some people too harshly,
Uh-huh.
being unforgiving
Uh-huh.
in ways. Because when facing my own imperfection, I realized that I had made it hard for some of my students,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I hadn't known that before.
Yeah.
Mm.
So it took a lot of, like I mentioned, courage, but the willingness to look deep and honestly for yourself.
Yeah, a lot. I'm
Yeah.
still in the midst of it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I'm very much I'm very much in a different place than I was
Uh-huh.
even 2 years ago.
Yeah. So the other part where you mentioned that I wanted to ask you about, this, you mentioned postmodern. What do you think that model evolutionary enlightenment of postmodern age, away from the mythic guru structure, what might that look like?
I'm still working on it.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm still working on it. So
So it's a chapter still to be written.
it's a chapter to be written. It's what the rest of my life is going to be about.
Uh-huh.
But there's many dimensions to it. But the most fundamental dimension is that we're demythologizing the gift of enlightened awareness. So as I began to say, that in the traditional era, when a human being had attained a measure of divinity, a measure of holiness,
Mm-hmm.
they were automatically assumed in their humanity to be perfect beings, and that's part of the projection, and it's also part of what you buy into when you step into that role of being on the receiving end of that projection, and maybe buying into it yourself, actually believing it.
Mm-hmm.
So how I'm understanding this next step is somehow finding a way to fully and honor the significance of the depth of what enlightenment actually is, which is the most profound gift we can give, and which is a higher state of consciousness and knowing that changes absolutely everything, and realizing that that we're still all, and the nature of which is an experience of perfection and totality and infinity, and realizing that as evolving human beings, evolving human beings, we're always going to be works in progress who are inherently imperfect and inherently flawed, and to be able to hold both of those at the same time and work to integrate them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Another part of it is that traditionally, whether it's been, it doesn't matter from which tradition, it could be Christianity or in Buddhism or in other cultures, people who've been the most serious and the most dedicated usually would take a radical path of leaving the world so they could focus completely on cultivating these spiritual capacities outside and away from the demands of culture. And I get more and more the sense that as we move from postmodern to this postmodern, or an integral culture will be, it seems apparent that the world is the world that we're living in. It really has to be the monastery. That has to be, because the place we want to affect change is the place where we're going to be living.
Mm-hmm.
And so somehow to bring an end to this duality between places like a monastery, or a place on the top of the mountain where we can go to let go of the world, so we can more deeply and vulnerably awaken to our own deepest interiors. We have to find some way to do that in the very world that we're living in, so the world can change as a result of our own awakening as much as possible. And for that to happen, we have to be able to transmit and to share that which we are knowing and realizing. So we have to be here to do that. So I haven't really thought about this as deeply as I need to, but moving away from the world into doing that, I think is part of what has to change. We have to learn how to go that deep here where we already are, but in a way that will look different and it's going to feel different. Because if you go into a monastery, you go into a place where people are living in a much higher state of consciousness, it looks different and it feels different. So we need to be able to do that here, because what we're talking about is real and it doesn't look different and it feels different. It's a completely different context, and it has a different fragrance. It has a different purpose, has a different meaning, and it's much more awake. It's much more conscious. So we have to find a way to bring that, the presence of that kind of depth and that kind of clarity and that kind of purposefulness here where we are.
Mm-hmm. And as people awaken to this evolutionary impulse, they're even more present in this sense of being here. We're bringing the monastery here. That's what you're.
Ideally,
Yeah.
ideally, but I'm not just talking about being here now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not just talking about being where we already are. I'm talking about bringing this awakened creative motivation that inherently compels us to move forward, always more forward and always higher here.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a resting in being.
Yeah.
It's like being on the edge of living on the edge of a creative potential.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're on the very edge of a potential with someone else or with others, everybody's much more awake than they are than if they're not. And the only way I can usually share this idea with people is if you think if you're in the, if we were in a time of war, and this house was being surrounded, and we all had to figure out what we were going to do. So there'd be a level of attention that we would be bringing to each other because it was life and death.
Mm-hmm.
So ideally, not as for survival, but for the sake of creative potential and the possibility of higher emergence, we were able to bring that level of attention and intensity of attention and care to what it is that we're sharing. It creates a different intersubjective or cultural environment.
Uh-huh.
So giving rise to that is what I'm very interested in.
Yeah.
But here, not there.
Yeah. And it sounds like, or not sounds like, but that's what you had in the community of Enlightened Next. And one of the things in the Enlightened Next magazine, the website, and other places, the concept of scenius that was discussed, the scene of genius, the term that scenes of genius that Brian Eno coined, musician Brian Eno, and that was something that was discussed again in the magazine. You discussed it, so I wonder if you could say more, because that sounds like that's what this gathering of people awakening to that creative impulse is all about.
Well, the whole idea of scenius is that genius arises from scenes, or when there's groups of individuals that are awake, that are experiencing certain currents in culture,
Mm-hmm.
and they usually gather together in salons, like they did in Vienna, in coffee shops, and in particular, and when something's happening, like was happening in the '60s, then when something new starts to emerge, then
Mm-hmm.
genius emerges from the scenius.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's where the utopian impulse is carrying us. And that, I mean, for a while we were doing that, and for a while, and I urgently want to find a way to do it again, but in a different and more
Mm-hmm.
evolved way.
Yeah.
Because nothing's more exciting than that,
Yeah.
than living on the edge of the possible with other people who are really doing it.
Yeah. So when you say do it again, do it in an evolved way, how does that differentiate from how you
Well,
did
I think
before?
there were certain there was a certain rigidity about how I was seeing people, and in the structures of the community were very traditional and held. Some people were held back. Some people were very much developed beautifully in that situation. Other people had developmental needs
Mm-hmm.
that the way I set things up wasn't able to meet the developmental needs of a lot of people. And as a result, some of them suffered as a result and weren't given the kind of help that they needed. So I'd want to do this in a way that I'd be able to take more people along
Mm-hmm.
on the journey and be able to include more people.
Yeah. So would you say, I wasn't privy to the interactions and things there then,
Yeah.
but in helping people, trying to help people awaken to the evolutionary impulse, do you come up against their shadow, the
Yes,
psychological,
everything.
and do you feel like you were pushing people more than they could?
At certain points, I did, definitely.
Yeah, and some people got it and some didn't.
Some people got it. Some people really got it. Sometimes groups got it and really didn't, and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
other people didn't and suffered a lot as a result.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a certain period of time when I was pushing very hard
Uh-huh.
because I felt that that's what I was needed to do to get people to change,
Mm-hmm.
and some people rose to the occasion. Other people couldn't handle it and,
Yeah.
and suffered a great deal.
Yeah. So in hindsight, would you have done it differently, or is it, or
In
be more
hindsight,
selective?
I
Or
would have done a lot of things
yeah,
different.
yeah. The merits of 2020
The
hindsight.
merits of 2020, exactly. Well, that's why I'm very grateful that I still have time to
Yeah,
continue to
yeah,
work and to learn from my mistakes.
yeah. So that's the kind of the embodiment of evolutionary enlightenment is how we continue.
Self-correcting.
Yeah. The self-correcting principle of life. It feels like that scenius, that helping people in the new evolution, the new evolved way, really is how it'll come to be.
That's what I'm living for.
Yeah,
That's what I'm living for.
yeah. So you wrote an article on your website recently called "The Guru Who Learned to Drive." It was very, it started out very kind of little musing. You talked about you at the age of 61 recently. You had your first driving lesson. You're kind of laying yourself out. You're laying your soul, or being transparent. So it's very admirable that you're
Thank you.
doing that. What was the significance of the article, and why is it that you did have your first driving lesson at age 61?
Well, because the whole point of the article was about the death of the mythic ideal of the perfect guru.
Mm-hmm.
So me learning how to drive needing to learn how to drive myself around is basically me stepping off the pedestal of the throne and joining the human race like everybody else.
Yeah.
That was basically the idea behind it, and I was trying to describe how what it was like in the article. I described what it was like to become such a spiritually empowered human being, and what it was like to be treated so differently by so many people, and how empowering the whole system was to really to everybody involved. But in the long term, at this particular time in culture and postmodernity, it can't work because it's based upon also certain falsehoods that just have to be given up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So would you say a person looking for their own personal evolution, that model, the mythic guru, would not be the best way to do it?
I feel it's an outdated structure for the time we're living in, and almost all experiments that are working with that model usually end up failing in the long run. But they do so for understandable reasons, because they're based on ideas that are no longer true.
Yeah, yeah. So as we get towards the last stages here of our conversation, I want to go back to Senius and innovation, and I'm wondering, do you feel that innovation is a key component of being attuned to the evolutionary impulse?
Well, the evolutionary impulse compels us to give rise to that which is new, to that which doesn't exist yet. So it's reaching for the possible. It's about living on the edge of the possible, and to striving to create the conditions in which that which is possible will emerge and come into being. So absolutely.
Yeah. So we look at our time and space right here in our era 2017, and if we go back 10, 20, 30 years, the level of innovation that has happened, do you think that tells us, is that some sort of showing that innovation, evolutionary impulse is awaking in this larger sense in cultural evolution?
Well, innovations. As it's been said, the capacity to innovate has slowly been gathering speed for millennia, and now it's escalating at proportions that are dramatic, and it's become exponential. So innovation has become exponential. And it's happening at this point so quickly that it's almost impossible for us to even keep up with it. It's gone like this, and now it's on a vertical curve, it seems. And so we're living in a very different time in history because of that, because things are changing so rapidly. I think we're in a time of change where it's very difficult to know how to actually relate to it, because the rate of change for so many reasons is creating an existential sense of radical instability. Even though in many ways our lives are becoming much more convenient, and so many things are so much easier to do, in so many other ways, at an existential and spiritual level, there's a sense of profound sense of disequilibrium. Because you remember in the past, if we had children, we'd have some sense of the world that they were going to be growing up in,
Right.
and that their children would grow up in. But now, even if we had a child today, we can't even begin to imagine what the world that they'll be living in 50 years from now is like. So we're living in a very different time in history, which creates a lot of existential insecurity, reasonably and understandably, a lot of existential insecurity.
Yeah. And going back to Barbara Marx Hubbard again, she has the line that crises are evolutionary drivers. So it seems like,
Well, they're evolutionary drivers, but they don't always have happy endings.
well, this is true.
We don't know.
Yeah, yeah,
We don't know.
yeah. And that's where, with the help of your teachings, your work, helping for people to have a roadmap and navigating through this complicated world that gets more perplexing at times, and finding their way.
The teaching should help people to orient themselves at an existential level. It won't necessarily give them the answers to the practical questions or the practical challenges, but as an existential and metaphysical orientation to this time of greater complexity and speed, it should help them very, very much.
Yeah.
Because what you want to do, what the teaching makes you want to do, is to get out on the very crest of the wave. You want to be there,
Mm-hmm.
versus recoiling because it's all too much. Yeah.
Yeah. And what would you say an individual can do on a singular level in order to affect positive change and transformation in the world?
Well, from my being a spiritual teacher, so from my point of view, it would be to do everything they can to change themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if there was a world where, some people talk about like a tipping point where when 5 or 10% of the world or society becomes more evolved, awakened to the evolutionary impulse, society changes in a bigger way. Do you do you ever envision what a world like that would look like that, if we get to that crowning achievement?
Well, I'm usually thinking on a much smaller scale, and I don't think that there's going to be any grand tipping point where everybody's going to flip into anything particular.
Mm-hmm.
But certain segments of the population can get to a point where this kind of flip happens, where there's a radical shift of perspective. But we're talking about relatively, in terms of the population of the whole human race. We're talking about parts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Andrew, where do you think you're going next?
Well, I'm going in the direction of everything we've been speaking about,
Mm-hmm.
but just a much better, more improved version of it. And at this particular time in my life, as I'm restarting to teach again, I'm my spiritual work for me personally has to do with holding a great deal of. I feel there's things that I can feel that I can't articulate, that I want to know and that are going to come through, and so I'm holding an enormous space open in myself to call them in and through,
Mm-hmm.
because I feel like I'm holding in Zen they call it a Cohen,
Mm-hmm.
Cohen, which is finding the answer to an unanswerable question.
Mm-hmm.
And it very much has to do with the future and to where I'm going, what has to happen. Because I've realized so much and understood so much. I feel that everything that I've already done and accomplished has to go to a place it's never been before.
Mm-hmm.
In order to do that, there's a state of receptivity in myself that I'm working with great intensity on.
Uh-huh.
And I think a lot of the answers are going to come from there. But the non-metaphysical answer would just be a much better, more profound version of what I was working on before.
Yeah. And you're talking about being receptive to what comes in the process. What tools do you use for your own personal process to see where things come?
I meditate.
Mm-hmm.
I spend a lot of time in introspection and contemplation.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of time in discussion with my close friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking is I'm always busy with this. Like I don't have another life.
Mm-hmm.
This is not what I'm doing. This is a full-time. It's a full-time aspiration. It's a full-time contemplation. So I'm constantly busy only with this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can feel that it's being worked. Something's being worked, and something's being cultivated, and something's being developed. Mm-hmm. And as a result of this great ordeal that's recently happened, I feel a great focus about taking it
Mhm.
to a place it hasn't been before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure great things will come. And it said that for these moments of aha moments, epiphanies, it usually have to be incubated to let it
I feel
arise.
I'm in a great incubation period,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
be totally honest.
Yeah.
Very much
Well,
so.
we're all very be interested to see where it
Thank
goes.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So if people are interested in knowing your work or reading your writings, seeing what you're doing, what's the best way to
Go to my
find it?
my website at andrewcohen.com.
So andrewcohen.com,
Yeah.
and then you can see what's going on.
It'll all be there.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, I thank you. Thank you
you
very
very
much,
much.
Andrew.